Reinhold's closest friend was Heinrich. For 3 months, they shared the same trench, the same meals, the same fears, until he found that letter. What was inside would shatter everything Reinhold thought he knew about war, friendship, and the men sleeping just 3 feet away from him every night. But that letter was only the beginning of a secret so complex, it would take Reinhold decades to understand what really happened in those muddy trenches of 1916. Close your eyes and let me take you back to October 1916. The Western Front. Picture, if you will, a landscape that God himself seemed to have abandoned. The autumn rain had been falling for 6 straight days, turning the earth into a soup of mud, metal fragments, and things too terrible to name. The smell hung in the air like a living thing, cordite and decay, wet wool and human fear, all mixing into something that would cling to your clothes, your hair, your very soul for years after the war ended. In Trench Sector 7, carved into the French countryside like a scar across the face of civilization, 2 young German soldiers had formed a bond that felt unbreakable. Reinhold Weber, 19 years old, with blonde hair that had already begun turning gray from the stress of watching too many friends die. His hands, once steady enough to thread his mother's needle, now trembled whenever the artillery fell silent. And Heinrich Müller, 22, tall and lean, with that distinctive scar running from his left ear to his jawline, a memento, he claimed, from a childhood accident with a rusty fence. But nothing about Heinrich was quite what it seemed. Heinrich had arrived at Trench Sector 7 on a Tuesday morning in September, 3 weeks after Reinhold had been assigned to this particular slice of hell. He'd come with the replacement troops, carrying his gear with the same weary resignation as every other soldier who'd learned that survival was more about luck than skill. Within hours, he'd been paired with Reinhold for night watch duty, and within days, they were inseparable. What struck everyone about Heinrich was his calmness. While other soldiers jumped at every distant explosion, while they checked and rechecked their weapons with nervous energy, Heinrich moved with a deliberate, almost meditative precision. He had this habit of humming every morning as he cleaned his rifle. Always the same song, Die Wacht am Rhein, The Watch on the Rhine. His deep, resonant voice would echo through the narrow confines of their earthen home, and somehow, impossibly, it made the other soldiers feel safer. As if Heinrich's voice could keep the artillery shells at bay, as if his steady presence was a charm against the random violence that claimed men every day. Reinhold would write in his diary later, Heinrich's morning song became our church bell. When I heard it, I knew we'd survived another night. When he stopped singing, I knew something was wrong, even before the officers came with bad news. The trench itself was a masterpiece of desperate engineering. 8 feet deep, with walls reinforced by sandbags, wooden planks, and sheets of corrugated metal salvaged from destroyed buildings. The floor was a constantly shifting mixture of wooden duckboards and mud that seemed to have a malevolent life of its own. During the day, you could see rats the size of cats scurrying along the walls, their red eyes reflecting what little light filtered down from above. At night, you could hear them moving, always moving, searching for things that soldiers tried not to think about. The living conditions were indescribable to anyone who hadn't experienced them. 12 men shared a space smaller than most people's bedrooms, sleeping in shifts, eating cold rations, and relieving themselves in buckets that were emptied when someone drew the short straw. Privacy was a concept that belonged to another world. You learned things about your fellow soldiers that no human being should ever know about another, and somehow, in that enforced intimacy, bonds formed that were stronger than family. But you don't know yet what Heinrich was really singing about. You don't understand why a man who claimed to be from Bavaria spoke with just a hint of an accent that none of his fellow soldiers could quite place. Let me paint you a more detailed picture of their friendship, because understanding it is crucial to understanding what came later. Heinrich was everything Reinhold wasn't. Where Reinhold was anxious, constantly checking his rifle, constantly looking over the trench wall for signs of enemy movement, Heinrich was calm, methodical. He'd clean his equipment with almost religious precision, taking apart his rifle piece by piece every morning, oiling each component, checking each mechanism. Every button on his uniform was polished, every piece of leather was oiled and supple. His uniform, despite the mud and chaos around them, always looked pristine. This wasn't unusual in itself. Many soldiers developed obsessive habits as a way of maintaining some control in an environment where control was an illusion. But Heinrich's precision was different. It wasn't born of anxiety or fear. It was professional. Practiced. As if he'd been trained not just to maintain equipment, but to maintain an appearance. "How do you do it?" Reinhold had asked him once, during a particularly quiet evening in early October. The sun was setting somewhere beyond the smoke and haze, painting the sky a sickly orange color. The rats were beginning their nightly scavenging runs around their feet, and the distant sound of enemy machinery hummed like a deadly lullaby. They could hear the French soldiers talking in their own trenches, maybe 50 yards away, their voices carrying across no man's land like ghosts. Heinrich had looked up from cleaning his boots, that half-smile playing on his lips that Reinhold would later remember with such painful clarity. "How do I do what, my friend? Stay so composed. So organized. The rest of us are falling apart, and you look like you're preparing for a parade inspection." Heinrich had been quiet for a moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his voice carried that careful German accent that seemed just slightly too perfect, like an actor who'd studied his role very thoroughly. "My friend," he'd said, "when you know your purpose, everything else becomes simple." Reinhold had nodded, thinking he understood. He assumed Heinrich meant their duty as soldiers. The fatherland. Kaiser Wilhelm II. The great cause they were all supposedly fighting for. The things every German soldier was supposed to believe in, even when those beliefs became harder to maintain with each friend who died, with each day spent in this muddy grave they called a trench. But Heinrich's purpose was something entirely different. Something that would have gotten him shot if anyone had discovered it. Something that would have gotten Reinhold shot too, just for being his friend. To understand the magnitude of what happened later, you need to understand how complete their friendship had become. In Trench Sector 7, Heinrich and Reinhold had developed a routine that structured their days and gave them both something to hold onto when the world seemed to be dissolving around them. They woke before dawn, roused by the changing of the guard or by the sound of morning artillery exchanges. Heinrich always woke first, never seeming to need more than 3 or 4 hours of sleep. He would lie quietly for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the trench coming alive, then begin his morning ritual. First, the humming, always, Die Wacht am Rhein, always in the same key, with the same measured tempo. Then the cleaning of his rifle, each piece laid out on a clean cloth with mathematical precision. Reinhold would wake to the sound of Heinrich's humming and feel, for just a moment, safe. Heinrich's presence had become like a security blanket, a guarantee that the world still had some order left in it. While other soldiers grumbled and cursed their way into consciousness, Reinhold would watch Heinrich work, marveling at his friend's steady hands, his unshakable routine. After weapons maintenance came breakfast, if you could call it that. Usually hardtack and weak coffee, sometimes supplemented with tinned meat that had traveled hundreds of miles and tasted like the metal containers it came in. Heinrich and Reinhold always shared their rations, creating a ritual of fairness and mutual care. If Heinrich had received a package from home, which happened surprisingly often for someone who claimed to be from a poor Bavarian farming family, he would share everything equally. Chocolate, real coffee, sometimes even small bottles of schnapps that made the evening more bearable. "My sister Greta," Heinrich would say, holding up a letter that accompanied these packages. "She works in a bakery now, sends me treats whenever she can afford it." Reinhold never questioned how a baker's assistant could afford to send such expensive items, or how packages from Bavaria arrived with postmarks from different parts of Germany. He was simply grateful for Heinrich's generosity and touched by his friend's obvious love for his family. The days were filled with the tedious, terrifying work of being a soldier. Standing watch, cleaning equipment, reinforcing the trench walls, and always listening for the whistle of incoming artillery. Heinrich and Reinhold were often paired for these duties, and they developed a rhythm of communication that barely required words. A glance from Heinrich might warn Reinhold to duck just before a sniper's bullet cracked overhead. A touch on the shoulder might signal that it was time to move to a different section of the trench. Heinrich seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict danger. He would suggest they move to the supply bunker just minutes before artillery struck their usual position. He would recommend they volunteer for kitchen duty on days when other work details came under attack. His fellow soldiers began to joke that Heinrich had a sixth sense about these things. "You're like a good luck charm, Müller," Sergeant Hoffman had said one evening after Heinrich had somehow guided the entire squad away from a section of trench that was destroyed by a direct hit less than an hour later. "Maybe you should be our official fortune teller." Heinrich had smiled at the joke, but Reinhold noticed that his friend's laugh seemed forced. Almost nervous point. One of the things that bonded Heinrich and Reinhold most closely was their shared ritual of reading letters from home. Mail call was a sacred time in Trench Sector 7. When the postal clerk arrived with his leather satchel, conversation stopped, work halted, and everyman held his breath hoping to hear his name called. Reinhold's letters came irregularly, usually from his mother in Hamburg. They were filled with news about neighbors, complaints about food shortages, and always, desperate questions about when he might be coming home. His mother's handwriting was shaky, her spelling imperfect, but her love was evident in every word. She would include pressed flowers from their small garden, or a small sketch of their house, anything to remind her son of the world beyond the trenches. Heinrich's letters were different. They came more frequently, sometimes twice a week, and they were always in perfect German script. The paper was good quality, the ink was expensive, and the content was strangely formal for family correspondence. Heinrich would read passages aloud, sharing news about his sister Greta's work at the bakery, his father's struggles with the harvest, his mother's health problems. But Reinhold, who had grown up in a working-class family, sometimes noticed things that seemed off about these letters. They mentioned foods that poor farmers couldn't afford, books that uneducated peasants wouldn't read, cultural events that wouldn't happen in remote Bavarian villages. When he mentioned these discrepancies to Heinrich, his friend always had explanations. "Greta has educated friends," Heinrich would say. "She writes about their experiences as if they were ours." Or, "My father may be a simple farmer, but he has dreams of better things." The explanations were always reasonable, and Reinhold never pressed the issue. In a war where everyone was pretending to be braver than they felt, where everyone was hiding their fears behind masks of duty and patriotism, a few embellishments about family circumstances seemed harmless. Besides, Heinrich was always willing to share these letters, reading them aloud by candlelight while the other soldiers listened. His descriptions of civilian life, of normal families doing normal things, provided a kind of spiritual nourishment that was as important as food. Heinrich's letters reminded them all that somewhere beyond the wire and mud and death, ordinary life continued. The first hint that something might be unusual about Heinrich came in late September, about 2 weeks after his arrival. The incident was small, easily overlooked, but it stayed with Reinhold like a splinter in his mind. A French prisoner had been captured during a night raid, a young soldier not much older than Reinhold himself. He was wounded, frightened, and refused to answer any questions from the German interrogators. The men had been brought to their section of trench while waiting for transport to a proper prisoner of war facility. Most of the German soldiers ignored the prisoner, but Heinrich seemed drawn to him. Reinhold watched his friend approach the Frenchman, speaking softly in what Reinhold assumed was broken French, the kind of phrases any educated German might know. But as the conversation continued, Reinhold realized that Heinrich's French was far from broken. He was speaking fluently, idiomatically, with perfect pronunciation and complex grammatical structures. When the French prisoner began to relax and respond, Heinrich was able to conduct what amounted to a sophisticated conversation about literature, philosophy, and life before the war. When Reinhold asked about it later, Heinrich had shrugged dismissively. "My mother was from Alsace-Lorraine," he explained. "She spoke French at home when I was young." You pick up more than you realize. This explanation made sense. Alsace-Lorraine had changed hands between France and Germany several times, and many families in that region were genuinely bilingual. But something about Heinrich's French had seemed too perfect, too natural. It wasn't the French of someone who had learned it as a child from a parent. It was the French of someone who had lived in France, who had thought in French, who had dreamed in French. But Reinhold pushed these concerns aside. Heinrich was his friend, his closest companion in this nightmare. Everyone had secrets, everyone had aspects of their past they preferred not to discuss. The war had taught them all to focus on the present, on survival, on the bonds that held them together in impossible circumstances. You still don't understand what this meant. Let me explain why finding a French letter in a German trench wasn't just suspicious, it was potentially a death sentence for everyone involved. The discovery that would change everything happened on a Thursday morning, October 12th. It had been raining for 3 days straight, the kind of cold, penetrating rain that soaked through every layer of clothing and turned the trench into a flowing river of mud and misery. The duckboards that served as their floor had shifted and warped, creating pools of stagnant water that reflected the gray sky above like dead eyes. Heinrich had left his jacket draped over his sleeping area while he went to the communal latrine, a horrific construction of wooden planks positioned over a pit that had been dug 50 yards behind their section of trench. It was a journey every soldier had to make several times a day, but one that required careful timing. The latrine was exposed to enemy observation, and snipers had developed an unfortunate habit of targeting men during their most vulnerable moments. Reinhold was cleaning his rifle nearby, performing the same ritual that Heinrich had taught him: complete disassembly, careful cleaning of each component, reassembly with the kind of precision that might mean the difference between life and death. The work required concentration, but it was also meditative, a way of keeping his hands busy while his mind tried to process the things he'd seen, the friends he'd lost, the impossible situation they all found themselves in. That's when he saw something fall from the inside pocket of Heinrich's jacket. A folded piece of paper, cream-colored and expensive-looking, different from their standard military correspondence. The paper caught what little light filtered down into the trench, standing out against the brown mud and gray metal that surrounded them. Reinhold's first instinct was simply to return it. He and Heinrich shared everything: their food, their fears, their letters from home, their dreams of what they would do when the war ended. They'd read each other's mail countless times, laughing about Heinrich's, Sister Greta's, cooking disasters or Reinhold's mother's increasingly frantic advice about keeping his feet dry and saying his prayers. Privacy, like so many other civilian concepts, had been abandoned in the trenches, but when Reinhold picked up the paper, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The writing on the outside wasn't in German. It was in French. Elegant, flowing French script that spoke of education, culture, refinement, all things that seemed impossibly distant from their muddy, violent world. Reinhold stared at the folded paper for a long moment, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. French writing. In Heinrich's jacket. In a German trench, there were legitimate reasons a German soldier might have French documents. Captured intelligence reports, intercepted communications, souvenirs taken from dead enemies. But those documents would be official military papers, handled through proper channels, shared with commanding officers. This looked personal. Private, the paper felt heavier in Reinhold's hands than its physical weight could account for. It was heavier with implication, with possibility, with the terrible weight of questions that might have answers he didn't want to know. Finding a French letter in a German trench wasn't just suspicious, it was potentially treasonous. The French were the enemy. They were the ones shooting at them every day, the ones who'd killed Müller with a sniper's bullet last Tuesday, the ones who'd gassed Schmidt so badly that he died choking on his own blood, the ones who'd torn young Franz apart with an artillery shell while he was carrying messages between trenches. The French were faceless monsters who lived in the parallel world of trenches 50 yards away, close enough to hear their voices on quiet nights, close enough to smell their cooking fires, but alien and hostile and dedicated to killing every German soldier they could find. The idea that Heinrich who shared his rations, Heinrich who covered for him when nightmares made sleep impossible, Heinrich who hummed gentle songs to keep their spirits up, might have some connection to those same French soldiers was almost unthinkable, but the evidence was in Reinhold's hands. He looked around the trench, making sure he was alone. The other soldiers in their section were busy with their own morning routines, cleaning weapons, writing letters, playing cards with a deck so worn that the suits were barely visible. No one was paying attention to him. The rain continued to fall, creating a curtain of sound that would mask any conversation. Reinhold's hands trembled as he held the paper. Part of him wanted to put it back immediately, pretend he'd never seen it, continue living in the world where Heinrich was simply his German friend and fellow soldier. But another part, the part that had kept him alive for 6 months in hell, the part that noticed when things didn't add up, the part that had saved his life by paying attention to details, told him this was important. Dangerous important. The paper was soft, expensive, the kind of stationery that wealthy civilians used for personal correspondence. Not the rough, gray paper that military personnel used for official documents. When Reinhold carefully unfolded it, the creases were soft and well worn, as if the letter had been read many times, carried close to someone's body, treasured. The handwriting inside was feminine, elegant, in blue ink that had faded slightly with age and handling. The French was formal, sophisticated, written by someone who had been educated in proper grammar and syntax. At the top, in carefully scripted letters that spoke of intimacy and affection, was a salutation that made Reinhold's world tilt on its axis: Mon cher Henri. My dear Henri, not Heinrich. Henri. Reinhold's French was limited, learned during his brief secondary education before the war had consumed his generation. But he'd been a good student, and 6 months of occasionally intercepting French communications had expanded his vocabulary in military terms. He could read enough to understand fragments, and those fragments painted a picture that made his stomach clench with dread. Information precious, precious information. Nos amis allemands, our German friends. La prochaine attaque, the next attack. Positions defensives, defensive positions. Trace dangerieux, very dangerous. The word swam before Reinhold's eyes as his mind tried to reject what he was seeing. This wasn't a love letter from a French sweetheart, wasn't a captured enemy document, wasn't any of the innocent explanations he desperately wanted to believe in. This was intelligence correspondence. This was someone in France writing to someone behind German lines about German military operations. Someone who had access to German plans, German weaknesses, German secrets. His mind began racing, trying to process the implications. Was Heinrich, was his best friend a spy? The idea seemed impossible. Heinrich, who shared his rations when Reinhold was sick with dysentery. Heinrich, who'd covered for him during night watch when Reinhold's hands wouldn't stop shaking after watching Private Berger die in a gas attack. Heinrich, who talked for hours about his sister Greta and her dream of opening her own bakery, about his parents' farm in Bavaria, about his plans to study literature when the war ended. Heinrich, who seemed to know when artillery strikes were coming, always moving their group to safer positions just minutes before shells fell. Heinrich, who volunteered for reconnaissance missions and always returned with unusually detailed intelligence about French positions. Heinrich, whose packages from home arrived with suspicious regularity and contained luxuries that poor Bavarian farmers couldn't afford. Heinrich, whose perfect French had impressed and puzzled Reinhold during the conversation with the French prisoner. But you haven't heard the worst part yet. You don't know what Reinhold found when he kept reading, when he forced himself to confront the truth that was staring at him from that cream-colored paper. Reinhold forced himself to continue reading, his elementary French struggling with the complex phrases and formal constructions. But certain words, certain concepts, jumped out at him like physical blows. Les positions allemands dans le secteur 7, German positions in Sector 7. Their sector. Faiblesse dans la défense orientale, weakness in the eastern defense. 47 hommes, 47 men. The exact number of German soldiers currently stationed in their section of trench. Reserves limits de munitions, limited ammunition reserves, and then, in the middle of the letter, a sentence that made Reinhold's world collapse entirely. Heinrich Müller n'existe pas. Je suis toujours votre Henri Dubois de Lille. Heinrich Müller doesn't exist. I am still your Henri Dubois from Lille. Reinhold dropped the letter as if it were on fire. It fluttered to the muddy floor of the trench, and for a moment he stared at it, his vision blurring, his breath coming in short gasps. Heinrich wasn't German. He was French. A French spy who'd been living, eating, sleeping, and sharing secrets with German soldiers for 3 months. Every morning song, every friendly conversation, every moment of brotherhood had been a lie. Every piece of intelligence Heinrich had gathered, troop movements, supply levels, defensive weaknesses, planned operations, had been passed along to French military commanders who would use that information to kill German soldiers. Maybe soldiers Heinrich knew personally. Maybe Reinhold himself. The betrayal hit Reinhold like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring, his chest tight with something that felt like drowning. This was worse than enemy artillery, worse than gas attacks, worse than watching his comrades die in no man's land. This was the destruction of trust itself, the shattering of the bonds that made survival possible in impossible circumstances. But even as his mind reeled with shock and betrayal, another part of him was already thinking tactically, calculating the implications. If Heinrich was a French spy, then everything Reinhold knew about enemy positions, planned operations, and strategic weaknesses was potentially compromised. But more than that, if Heinrich was discovered, everyone who'd associated with him would be suspect. Guilt by association was a concept that military justice applied liberally in wartime. Reinhold could be shot as a collaborator simply for being Heinrich's friend. The next few minutes were the longest of Reinhold's life. He stood in the muddy trench, staring at the letter that had fallen to the ground, while his mind tried to process what he'd learned. The rain continued to fall, but he barely noticed it. The sounds of the trench, soldiers talking, equipment being cleaned, the distant rumble of artillery, seemed to come from another world. Heinrich wasn't German. Heinrich was Henri, from Lille. A French city that was currently under German occupation, which meant Henri had somehow escaped occupied territory, assumed a false identity, and infiltrated German military forces. The planning, the skill, the sheer audacity required for such an operation was staggering, but more than the tactical implications, it was the personal betrayal that left Reinhold feeling physically sick. Every conversation they'd had, every moment of shared fear and friendship, every time Heinrich had comforted him during the worst nights, all of it had been performance. Heinrich had been studying him, manipulating him, using their friendship as cover for espionage. Or had he been, even in his shock and betrayal, Reinhold found himself remembering moments that complicated the simple narrative of deception. Heinrich's genuine concern when Reinhold had been sick with fever. The tears in Heinrich's eyes when young Franz had been killed. The way Heinrich had risked his own safety to drag wounded Sergeant Hoffmann to safety during an artillery barrage. If Heinrich was simply a cold-blooded spy, why had he shown such obvious emotion? Why had he taken personal risks to save German soldiers? Why had he shared his rations, his letters from home, his dreams and fears? Was it possible that Heinrich's friendship, even if built on a foundation of lies, had become genuine? Or was Reinhold simply a fool, desperately searching for ways to excuse the inexcusable? Reinhold picked up the letter from the mud, carefully folding it along its original creases. His hands were shaking, but his mind was beginning to work again, calculating possibilities, weighing options, trying to find a path through the maze of betrayal and confusion. He could report Heinrich immediately. Walk to the command bunker, inform Captain Weber about what he'd discovered, and watch as his friend was arrested, interrogated, and inevitably shot as a spy. It would be the correct action, the patriotic action, the action that would protect German military secrets and possibly save German lives, but it would also mean the death of the person who had been his closest companion for months, the person who had helped him survive the psychological hell of trench warfare, the person who, regardless of his true nationality or motivations, had shown him kindness and friendship when both were in desperately short supply. And what if Reinhold was wrong? What if there was another explanation? The letter could be a plant, designed to frame Heinrich. It could be genuine correspondence that Heinrich had intercepted from a real French spy. It could be part of some complex counterintelligence operation that was beyond Reinhold's understanding, but even as he considered these possibilities, Reinhold knew they were desperate rationalizations. The letter was too personal, too detailed, too intimate to be anything other than genuine correspondence between Henri Dubois and his handlers in French intelligence. No, Heinrich was a spy. The only question was what Reinhold was going to do about it. As Reinhold stood in the trench, holding evidence that could get his best friend executed, he found himself thinking about the nature of friendship itself. What did it mean to care about someone? What obligations did friendship create? And how did those obligations change when the friend turned out to be an enemy? In his short life, Reinhold had never faced moral complexity of this magnitude. The war had been presented to him in simple terms: Germany versus her enemies, good versus evil, duty versus cowardice. But Heinrich's existence complicated all of those simple categories. Here was someone who was simultaneously friend and enemy, protector and betrayer, genuine and false. Heinrich had saved Reinhold's life on multiple occasions. His uncanny ability to predict danger had kept not just Reinhold but their entire unit safer. If Heinrich was passing information to French intelligence, he was also clearly protecting the German soldiers he lived among. It was as if he were trying to serve two masters simultaneously, balancing loyalty to France with genuine affection for his German comrades. But how many French soldiers had died because of information Heinrich provided to German forces? And how many German soldiers had died because of information Heinrich provided to French forces? The moral calculus was impossible to compute. Reinhold realized that he was facing a choice that would define not just Heinrich's fate, but his own character. Was he a German soldier first, bound by duty to his country and his uniform? Or was he a human being first, bound by loyalty to the person who had shown him friendship in the darkest period of his life. Lost in his moral anguish, Reinhold almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching through the mud. Heinrich was returning from the latrine, picking his way carefully along the treacherous duckboards, his head down against the rain. In moments, he would be back at their shared living space, and Reinhold would have to face him with the knowledge of what he'd discovered. Quickly, Reinhold shoved the letter into his own jacket pocket and tried to compose himself. He picked up his rifle and resumed cleaning it, though his hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold the cleaning rod. When Heinrich appeared around the corner of the trench, Reinhold forced himself to look up and nod casually. "Terrible weather," Heinrich observed, shaking rain from his cap before settling down in his usual spot. "I swear it's been raining since the war began." "Yes," Reinhold managed, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Terrible weather." Heinrich gave him a sharp look. "Are you feeling well, my friend? You look pale." The concern in Heinrich's voice sounded genuine. His eyes, those blue eyes that had always seemed so honest, so loyal, showed what appeared to be real worry. If Heinrich was acting, he was a master of the craft. "I'm fine," Reinhold lied. "Just tired." Heinrich nodded, but continued to watch him with that careful attention that Reinhold now understood might be professional evaluation rather than friendly concern. How much had Heinrich learned about him during their months together? What details about Reinhold's personality, his fears, his weaknesses, had found their way into intelligence reports bound for French military commanders? Now you're about to witness something that will chill you to the bone, watching someone you thought you knew become a complete stranger while never changing at all. Heinrich began his usual morning routine, the methodical cleaning of his rifle, each piece laid out with mathematical precision on a clean cloth. But now Reinhold saw the routine differently. This wasn't the obsessive behavior of an anxious soldier trying to maintain control. This was the practiced discipline of a professional who had been trained to maintain his equipment and his cover with equal skill. "I received another letter from Greta yesterday," Heinrich said conversationally as he worked. "She's been promoted at the bakery. The owner says she has real talent for pastry work." Before his discovery, Reinhold would have smiled at this news, would have asked questions about Heinrich's family, would have shared in his friend's obvious pride. Now, he listened to the lies with growing horror. There was no Sister Greta. There was no family bakery. There might not even be a family at all. "That's wonderful," Reinhold forced himself to say. "She must be very talented." "She is," Heinrich agreed, and for a moment his expression softened in what looked like genuine affection. "I hope you'll meet her someday, after the war. I think you'd like each other." The casual reference to a post-war future, to a time when they might visit each other's families and continue their friendship in civilian life, felt like a knife twist. Heinrich was either a sociopathic manipulator of extraordinary skill, or he was somehow capable of genuine emotion despite his false identity. Neither possibility was comforting. As the morning progressed, Reinhold found himself analyzing every word Heinrich spoke, every gesture he made, looking for signs of deception he'd previously missed. Heinrich's German was perfect, but was it perhaps too perfect? His knowledge of Bavarian culture and geography was extensive, but might it be the result of careful study rather than lived experience? The more Reinhold observed, the more convinced he became that Heinrich, Henri, was a master of his craft. The man had created not just a false identity but a complete alternate personality, one so convincing that he'd fooled dozens of German soldiers and officers for months. The level of preparation and skill required was almost admirable. If it hadn't been used to potentially kill Reinhold's countrymen, the rest of the morning passed in a kind of psychological torture. Heinrich behaved exactly as he always had: friendly, calm, considerate of his fellow soldiers. He shared his breakfast rations with Private Muller, who'd received nothing in the last mail delivery. He helped Sergeant Hoffman repair a damaged section of trench wall. He cleaned his equipment with the same methodical precision that had always characterized his routine, but now every act of kindness looked like manipulation. Every moment of camaraderie seemed calculated. Every expression of concern appeared to be the performance of a trained actor, and yet, there were moments when Heinrich's emotions seemed too genuine to be performance. When he helped Muller, there was real compassion in his eyes. When he worked on the trench repairs, he showed the same concern for structural integrity that any soldier would feel about his own safety. When he joked with the other men, his laughter seemed unforced and natural. Was it possible that Heinrich had become genuinely fond of the German soldiers he was supposed to be betraying? Could a spy develop real friendships even while maintaining false identity? The psychological complexity was staggering. Around midday, an incident occurred that would test both Heinrich's abilities and Reinhold's capacity to maintain his own performance. A German patrol had captured another French prisoner during a morning raid, and the man was brought to their section of trench while waiting for transport to interrogation facilities. This prisoner was different from the young soldier Reinhold had watched Heinrich speak with weeks earlier. This man was older, more experienced, and clearly terrified. He'd been wounded during his capture, nothing serious, but enough to leave him bloody and shaken. When he was brought into the trench, he immediately began speaking rapidly in French, pleading for medical attention, for water, for mercy. Most of the German soldiers ignored him, as they'd been trained to do. Fraternization with prisoners was discouraged, and most of the men had learned to see captured enemies as objects rather than human beings. It was easier that way, psychologically simpler, but Heinrich, as he had before, seemed drawn to the prisoner's distress. Reinhold watched with new eyes as his friend approached the wounded Frenchman, speaking in what he now knew was fluent, native French. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in intelligence gathering disguised as humanitarian concern. Heinrich asked about the man's wounds, offered him water, inquired about his family back home. But woven throughout these expressions of kindness were subtle questions about French troop dispositions, supply levels, morale among the enemy forces. The prisoner, grateful for any show of human decency, began to open up. He spoke about his unit's recent movements, their equipment shortages, their officers' concerns about an upcoming German offensive. Heinrich listened with the perfect expression of sympathetic interest, occasionally asking follow-up questions that seemed motivated by curiosity rather than military intelligence needs. Reinhold found himself in the bizarre position of watching his best friend expertly interrogate an enemy soldier while the other Germans in the trench remained completely unaware of what was happening. To them, Heinrich was simply being kind to a wounded prisoner. In reality, he was conducting a sophisticated intelligence operation. When the prisoner was finally taken away, Heinrich returned to his usual position with a thoughtful expression. "Poor man," he said to Reinhold. "He has 3 children at home. I can't imagine what his wife is going through." The comment was perfectly calculated to emphasize Heinrich's humanity, his ability to see enemies as fellow human beings rather than faceless threats. But now Reinhold understood that Heinrich's humanitarian concerns were secondary to his intelligence gathering. The prisoner's family situation was mentioned not out of empathy, but as a way of establishing rapport that had made the men more willing to share military information. That evening, as the men settled into their usual routines of letter writing, card playing, and quiet conversation, Reinhold made his decision about how to handle what he'd learned. He couldn't simply ignore Heinrich's deception. The moral weight of allowing enemy espionage to continue was too great. But neither could he immediately report his friend without giving him a chance to explain. He would confront Heinrich directly. The opportunity came during the night watch. Reinhold and Heinrich were assigned to the 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. shift, a time when the trench was quieter than usual, when most of the men were trying to catch a few hours of sleep despite the discomfort of their surroundings. It was the perfect time for a private conversation that wouldn't be overheard or interrupted. They took their positions at the observation post, a section of trench where the walls had been built slightly higher to provide better sight lines across no man's land. The rain had finally stopped, and through the haze and smoke, they could see the faint lights of the French trenches in the distance. Occasionally, they could hear voices carrying across the muddy wasteland between the opposing forces, French soldiers talking among themselves in what they probably thought was perfect safety. For the first hour, they maintained the usual protocol of night watch, silent vigilance, careful observation, periodic checks of equipment and ammunition. But as the night deepened and the trench grew quieter, Reinhold knew it was time to act. "Heinrich," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, my friend. Tell me about your family. Your real family." Even in the darkness, Reinhold could sense Heinrich's sudden stillness. The change in his posture was subtle but unmistakable, the shift from relaxed alertness to focused tension. "You know about my family, Reinhold. My sister Greta, my parents in Bavaria, your real family." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Reinhold could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the letter in his jacket pocket like a physical presence. In the distance, a flare went up from the French lines, briefly illuminating the scarred landscape of no man's land before fading back to darkness. When Heinrich finally spoke, his voice was different. Quieter. More careful. "How long have you known? What happened next would change everything you thought you understood about loyalty, friendship, and the nature of truth itself." Reinhold pulled out the cream-colored letter, its edges now soft from handling and slightly stained with mud. Even in the darkness, Heinrich recognized what it was. "The letter fell from your jacket this morning," Reinhold whispered. "I wasn't trying to spy on you. I was just going to put it back." Heinrich stared at the letter for a long moment, then slowly reached out and took it from Reinhold's hands. His fingers traced the familiar creases, and when he looked up, his expression was one of resignation rather than fear. "I wondered when this moment would come," he said quietly. "I've been waiting for it, in a way." "So it's true? You're French?" Henri nodded slowly. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it confirmed what Reinhold had already known. "I'm French. My real name is Henri Dubois. I'm from Lille." The admission hit Reinhold like a physical blow, even though he'd been expecting it. To hear the truth spoken aloud made it real in a way that reading the letter hadn't. His best friend, the person he'd shared his deepest fears with, the person who'd kept him sane during the worst months of his life, was a French spy. Why? The question came out as barely more than a breath. "Why did you do this to me? To us?" Heinrich was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the letter in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion that seemed genuine despite everything Reinhold now knew about his capacity for deception. "Do you want the simple answer or the complicated one?" "I want the truth. The simple answer is that I'm a spy. I was sent to infiltrate German positions, gather intelligence about your defensive capabilities, your troop strengths, your supply lines, and report back to French military command." Reinhold's hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, but Heinrich shook his head. "The complicated answer," Heinrich continued, "is that I never expected to care about any of you. I certainly never expected to care about you. What followed was the most extraordinary conversation of Reinhold's life. Sitting in a muddy trench, surrounded by the tools and debris of mechanized warfare, his best friend began to reveal the true story of his existence. For the past 3 months, Heinrich had been recruited by French military intelligence 18 months earlier, shortly after the German occupation of his hometown of Lille. His mother had indeed been from Alsace-Lorraine, making his German language skills native level. His father had been a professor of German literature at the University of Lille, giving Heinrich deep knowledge of German culture, history, and literature. When the Germans occupied northern France, Heinrich had initially worked as a translator and liaison officer, helping German administrators communicate with French civilians. But Heinrich's real value to French intelligence was his psychological profile. He was calm under pressure, naturally observant, capable of maintaining complex deceptions over extended periods. More importantly, he had what intelligence officers called natural charisma, the ability to make people trust him, to create genuine emotional connections even while maintaining false identity. "I was supposed to be here for 2 weeks, Heinrich explained, his voice barely audible above the distant sounds of artillery. "Get information about your defensive positions, identify weak points in your lines, document your supply procedures, then disappear during the confusion of a planned French assault." So what went wrong? Heinrich laughed bitterly. Everything went wrong. The intelligence officer who was supposed to extract me was killed in a British artillery strike 3 days after I arrived. My backup contact was captured during a German raid. Suddenly I was completely cut off from French command, alone behind enemy lines with no way to get home. So you stayed. I stayed. And I watched you cry in your sleep during your first week here. I watched you share your last piece of bread with Muller when he was sick with dysentery. I watched you write letters to your mother, telling her you were safe when bullets were flying over your head every day. Heinrich looked directly at Reinhold, and in the dim light, his eyes seemed to glisten with unshed tears. I watched you become the best friend I've ever had. But Heinrich's confession revealed layers of complexity that Reinhold hadn't anticipated. Cut off from his handlers, forced to maintain his false identity indefinitely, Heinrich had gradually developed genuine relationships with the German soldiers around him. But he'd also managed to re-establish contact with French intelligence through a network of civilian contacts in occupied territories. "The information I've been sending back," Heinrich continued, "it's not what my original handlers expected. Yes, I report your troop movements, your supply levels, your defensive weaknesses. But I also report French weaknesses to German intelligence." Reinhold's mind reeled. "What do you mean?" "I mean I've become a double agent without meaning to. Every piece of information I send to France, I balance with information that helps Germany. When I learned about a planned French gas attack on Sector 5 last month, I made sure German intelligence found out about it. When I discovered German plans to assault the French positions near Hill 304, I warned French command." Heinrich's laugh was hollow, bitter. "I've been trying to keep both sides alive, Reinhold. Do you know how impossible that is? Do you know how many people want to kill me for reasons I can't even explain to them?" As Heinrich's story unfolded, Reinhold began to understand the psychological hell his friend had been living in. Heinrich was betraying both sides while trying to protect both sides. He was a German soldier who was actually French, a French spy who was protecting German soldiers, a double agent who seemed to be working for some higher cause that transcended national loyalties. "How many soldiers have died because of your reports?" Reinhold asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "I don't know," Heinrich whispered. "I try not to think about it. I tell myself that for every German who dies because of intelligence I pass to France, I've saved a Frenchman by warning German forces about planned attacks. For every Frenchman who dies because of intelligence I gave to Germany, I've saved a German by warning about French operations. Heinrich stared out across no man's land, toward the French trenches that held his countrymen. But I also don't know how many soldiers are alive because of my reports. Including you. What do you mean? Heinrich reached into his pocket and pulled out another piece of paper, this one standard German military correspondence. 3 days ago, I sent a message to German command about a planned French gas attack on this sector. Tomorrow morning, at 0400 hours. Reinhold stared at the paper, trying to process what Heinrich was telling him. You warned our side about a French attack. I warned your side about an attack that would have killed everyone in this trench, including you. The revelation that Heinrich had actively worked to protect the German soldiers in their sector, including Reinhold himself, added another layer of moral complexity to an already impossible situation. Heinrich wasn't just a spy reporting intelligence to enemy forces. He was actively manipulating both sides to minimize casualties, using his position as a double agent to create a strange kind of balance, but this protection came at a cost that Heinrich was clearly struggling to bear. He was living in constant fear of discovery by both sides. If the Germans found out he was French, he'd be shot as a spy. If the French discovered he was protecting German soldiers, he'd be executed as a traitor. His survival depended on maintaining perfect deception in both directions while somehow keeping his conscience intact. How do you do it? Reinhold asked. How do you live with all these lies? I don't sleep, Heinrich admitted. I haven't had a full night's sleep since I arrived here. Every night I lie awake wondering if this will be the day someone discovers the truth. Every conversation feels like a performance. Every friendship feels like a betrayal. Heinrich turned to look at Reinhold directly. Do you know what the worst part is? The worst part is that my friendship with you, my affection for the men in this unit, that's the most genuine thing in my life right now. But it's built on a foundation of lies so complete that I sometimes forget who I really am. As Heinrich's confession reached its conclusion, Reinhold found himself facing an even more complex moral choice than he'd anticipated. This wasn't simply a matter of a German soldier discovering a French spy. This was a situation involving a French spy who was protecting German soldiers, a double agent who seemed to be working to minimize casualties on both sides, and a friend whose deception was motivated by survival rather than malice. What happens now? Reinhold asked. Heinrich was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. That depends on you, my friend. You could report me to Captain Weber. Have me arrested and shot as a spy. It would be the correct action according to German military law. But if you report me, my replacement won't care about keeping you alive. The next French agent who infiltrates this sector won't share his rations with you when you're sick. He won't cover for you during night watch when your hands won't stop shaking. He won't warn German command about gas attacks. Heinrich smiled, that sad, complex smile that Reinhold was beginning to understand reflected the weight of impossible choices. And he probably won't be as conflicted about his loyalties as I am. Now comes the moment that will haunt Reinhold for the rest of his life, a choice between duty and friendship, between simple loyalty and complex truth. Reinhold stared at his friend, his enemy, his protector. Everything he'd believed about war, about loyalty, about the nature of friendship had been turned upside down in the space of a single conversation. Heinrich was a French spy, but he was also the person who'd kept Reinhold sane during the worst months of his life. He was a betrayer and a protector, an enemy and a friend, a liar whose lies were designed to keep people alive. The simple moral universe that had sustained Reinhold through months of war had collapsed. In its place was a world of impossible complexity, where right and wrong were no longer clearly defined, where loyalty could mean betrayal and betrayal could mean salvation. "I need time to think," Reinhold finally said. Heinrich nodded. "I understand. But Reinhold, whatever you decide, know this: my friendship with you, our brotherhood, that was real. That was never part of the mission. That was never in the intelligence reports. That was just human." That night, after their watch ended and they returned to their sleeping positions, Reinhold lay awake staring at the muddy ceiling of the trench. Heinrich was sleeping just feet away, and Reinhold could hear his steady breathing. The man who'd been his closest companion for months was a stranger, but he was also still his friend. The complexity of his situation was overwhelming. Heinrich was a French spy, but he was also actively protecting German soldiers. He was deceiving everyone around him, but his deceptions were designed to minimize casualties rather than maximize them. He was violating every principle of military loyalty, but he was also demonstrating a higher loyalty to human life itself. In his diary, Reinhold wrote, "How do you betray someone who's betraying everyone except you? How do you hate someone who's risking his life to keep you alive? War has made everything simple become complicated, and everything complicated become impossible. I thought I knew what loyalty meant, what friendship meant, what duty meant. Now I don't know anything except that the person who has been the best friend of my life is also my enemy, and somehow that makes him more of a friend, not less." The next morning brought validation of Heinrich's warning about the planned gas attack. At exactly 0400 hours, French artillery began dropping gas shells on the German positions to their left and right. Sector 7, their sector, was spared, having been evacuated during the night based on intelligence reports that had somehow reached German command. Reinhold watched Heinrich during the gas attack, looking for signs of satisfaction or regret at his role in thwarting his own countrymen's operation. But Heinrich's expression showed only relief that his friends had been protected, mixed with what appeared to be genuine sorrow for the French soldiers who would die when German forces, forewarned of the attack, launched their counter-offensive. As the gas dissipated and the all-clear was sounded, Heinrich began his usual morning routine, cleaning his rifle, checking his equipment, humming Die Wacht am Rhein, with that steady voice that had become such a source of comfort to the German soldiers around him. But now Reinhold understood the song differently. Heinrich wasn't singing about watching the Rhine for Germany. He was watching it for France. And somehow, he was also watching it for the men who shared his trench, regardless of their nationality. The moral complexity was staggering, but it was also oddly beautiful. In the midst of a war designed to reduce human beings to simple categories of friend and enemy, Heinrich had created something more complex, a form of loyalty that transcended national boundaries, a friendship that survived deception, a love that existed despite betrayal. Over the following days, Reinhold and Heinrich developed what might have been the strangest partnership in the history of warfare. Reinhold knew Heinrich was a French spy, and Heinrich knew that Reinhold knew. But they also both knew something else. They trusted each other more than they trusted their own military commands. The arrangement they created was based on absolute honesty between them, combined with continued deception toward everyone else. Heinrich continued sending reports to French intelligence, but he shared them with Reinhold first. Together, they crafted information that was technically accurate but strategically useless, troop movements that were already planned to change, supply levels that would be different by the time the intelligence reached French commanders, defensive positions that were scheduled for reconstruction. Meanwhile, Heinrich continued warning German command about French attacks, but now with Reinhold's help in making the warnings seem to come from German reconnaissance rather than enemy intelligence. They developed elaborate stories about captured French documents, intercepted communications, and observations made during night patrols. They created a code, hidden in their daily conversations. When Heinrich mentioned his sister Greta's cooking, it meant French troops were massing for an attack. When Reinhold talked about letters from his cousin Wilhelm, it meant German reinforcements were coming. When either of them complained about the weather in a specific way, it meant enemy artillery was likely to target their sector, but their secret alliance came at an enormous psychological cost. Both men were now living double lives within their double lives. Reinhold was protecting a French spy while serving as a German soldier, betraying his military oath to save his friend. Heinrich was serving French intelligence while actively working to minimize casualties on both sides, betraying his national loyalty to preserve his human connections. The other soldiers in their trench began to notice how often Heinrich and Reinhold seemed to anticipate danger. How they always managed to be in the safest positions during bombardments. How they never seemed surprised by enemy attacks. How their suggestions about trench improvements and defensive preparations always proved to be exactly what was needed. "You two are like fortune tellers," joked Private Muller one evening after they'd avoided another artillery strike by moving to a different section of the trench just minutes before it was hit. "Maybe you should set up shop after the war, predict the future for paying customers." Heinrich and Reinhold exchanged glances. If only Muller knew how accurate that observation was, and how dark the future they were predicting really looked. The constant deception was exhausting. Both men had to remember not just one false identity, but multiple layers of truth and falsehood. They had to be careful about what they knew and when they'd learned it, careful about which emotions were genuine and which were performed, careful about every word they spoke and every reaction they showed. 3 weeks into their new arrangement, their careful balance was threatened by the arrival of a new officer. Lieutenant Klaus Weber was a career military man, recently transferred from the Eastern Front, with a reputation for thorough investigation of anything that seemed irregular. His first week in Sector 7, he noticed the unusual survival rate of the unit, the accuracy of their intelligence about enemy movements, and the almost supernatural ability of certain soldiers to avoid danger. Lieutenant Weber began conducting private interviews with the men, asking detailed questions about their backgrounds, their sources of information, and their relationships with each other. When he interviewed Reinhold, the questions were probing and uncomfortable. "You and Private Mueller seem very close," Weber observed. "How did you meet?" "We were assigned to the same watch duties when he arrived," Reinhold replied carefully. "You form bonds quickly in conditions like these." "Indeed." "And Private Mueller, he's from Bavaria?" "Yes, sir. His family has a farm there." "Interesting. I'm also from Bavaria. Perhaps we know some of the same places." Weber made a note in his file. "I'll have to have a longer conversation with Private Mueller about our homeland." The threat was clear. Weber was suspicious, and he had the knowledge to test Heinrich's cover story in ways that other officers couldn't. If Heinrich couldn't convince Weber that he was genuinely Bavarian, their entire arrangement would collapse. But Heinrich's reaction to this threat would reveal the final secret, one that would change everything Reinhold thought he understood about his friend's true loyalties. When Reinhold warned Heinrich about Weber's suspicions, his friend's reaction was not what he expected. Instead of fear or panic, Heinrich seemed almost relieved. "It's time," Heinrich said quietly. "I've been waiting for this." "Waiting for what?" "For a reason to end this charade." Heinrich reached into his jacket and pulled out yet another letter, this one with official French military seals. "This arrived 3 days ago." My handlers are growing suspicious about the quality of my intelligence reports. They're sending someone to evaluate my effectiveness. Reinhold felt cold dread settling in his stomach. And if they find you ineffective? Spies who become ineffective don't get retirement packages, my friend. They get eliminated as security risks. The replacement was scheduled to arrive within the week. A new French agent who would infiltrate the German lines, assess Heinrich's performance, and either extract him or eliminate him. If Heinrich had indeed become too attached to the Germans, too compromised to be useful, he would be killed to prevent him from revealing French intelligence operations. At the same time, Lieutenant Weber was conducting his investigation with growing intensity. He'd already identified several inconsistencies in Heinrich's story about his Bavarian background, and he was preparing to submit a formal report recommending further investigation. Heinrich was trapped between two forces, each of which would kill him for different reasons. The Germans would execute him as a French spy. The French would eliminate him as a compromised agent. His only hope of survival lay in somehow satisfying both sides while revealing the truth to neither. "We have to run," Reinhold said when Heinrich explained the situation. "Desert. Both of us. We can disappear into the countryside, find some place where the war hasn't reached yet." Heinrich shook his head. "And go where?" "I'm a French spy in German-controlled territory, and you'd be a German deserter in French-controlled territory. We'd be shot by both sides within a week. Then what do we do?" Heinrich was quiet for a long moment, staring at the muddy walls of their trench. "We make my reports look more valuable. We give French intelligence something they want very badly. Such as genuine German military secrets. Real intelligence about planned operations, defensive weaknesses, supply vulnerabilities. Information valuable enough to convince my handlers that I'm still an effective agent." Reinhold felt sick. That would mean German soldiers die. Yes. Heinrich's plan was audacious and morally devastating. He would provide French intelligence with genuine, valuable German military secrets, information about planned offensives, defensive positions, supply lines, and strategic weaknesses. Real intelligence that could cause real damage to German military operations, but he would also continue warning German command about French operations that would use those secrets. It was a delicate balance that required perfect timing and enormous moral compromise. Heinrich would be directly responsible for German casualties while simultaneously working to minimize them. "If this goes wrong," Heinrich said, "we both die. If it goes right, a lot of other people might die instead." Reinhold thought about this for a long time. They were playing with lives, French lives, German lives, the lives of their friends in the trench. But they were also trying to survive in a situation where survival seemed impossible, where every choice led to someone's death. How many people die if we do nothing and they replace you with someone who doesn't care about keeping anyone alive? Reinhold asked. Heinrich nodded slowly. More. Many more. The next few days were the most tense of both men's lives. Heinrich prepared detailed reports about German defensive positions, supply lines, and planned operations. Real information that could cause real damage. But he also prepared warnings for German intelligence about how French forces planned to use that information. It was like choreographing a deadly dance, trying to make each side think they had an advantage while actually maintaining a murderous equilibrium. Heinrich would reveal German weaknesses to the French, but also reveal French attack plans to the Germans. The goal was to create a stalemate that looked like successful intelligence work to both sides. Reinhold helped by creating fake documents, forging signatures, and crafting believable but misleading information. They worked by candlelight in the deepest part of the trench, their heads bent together like conspirators, which, of course, they were conspirators against the war itself, trying to create pockets of survival in the midst of mechanized death. They were betraying everyone and protecting everyone simultaneously. They were writing intelligence reports designed to keep their enemies alive while convincing their allies that they were working to kill those same enemies. The new French agent arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, disguised as a replacement German soldier. Heinrich recognized him immediately, a man named Laurent, whom Heinrich had worked with during his training in French intelligence. Laurent was everything Heinrich wasn't: cold, professional, utterly without sentiment or moral complication. Reinhold watched from a distance as Heinrich and Laurent had what appeared to be a casual conversation between German soldiers sharing information about their previous postings. But he could see the tension in Heinrich's shoulders, the careful way he positioned himself to keep escape routes open, the subtle signs of a man who knew his life was being evaluated. That evening, Laurent approached Reinhold directly, speaking in perfect German with what seemed to be a genuine Prussian accent. "You're Weber, yes. Heinrich speaks of you often." Reinhold nodded, trying to appear casual while his heart hammered in his chest. "We've become good friends." "So I understand. Very close friends." There was something in Laurent's tone that made Reinhold's blood freeze. Laurent suspected. Somehow, the replacement agent had figured out that Heinrich was compromised, that his loyalties had been divided by personal relationships. "Heinrich is a good soldier," Reinhold said carefully. "We all respect him." "Indeed. Perhaps too much." Laurent smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Friendship can be a weakness in wartime, don't you think? It can make men forget their duties, their larger loyalties." That night, Laurent made his move. During the midnight watch, when the trench was at its quietest, he confronted Heinrich directly. But instead of speaking in German, as he had during the day, Laurent switched to rapid French that he assumed Reinhold couldn't understand, but Reinhold had been learning French from Heinrich for months, preparing for exactly this possibility. His understanding wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to follow the general meaning of their conversation. "You've become too attached," Laurent said in French. "Your reports show too much concern for German casualties. You're no longer effective as an agent." "My reports have provided valuable intelligence," Heinrich replied, also in French, but with careful control. "The information I've gathered has helped French operations succeed. Your intelligence has also helped German operations succeed. You've been protecting them." Laurent's hand moved to his sidearm. "I'm here to terminate your assignment. Permanently." What happened next would haunt Reinhold's dreams for the rest of his life, and reveal the true depth of friendship that can exist even in the midst of perfect betrayal. Reinhold had seconds to decide. Stay hidden and let Laurent kill his friend, or reveal himself and probably get them both killed. Heinrich, his best friend, his brother in arms, his enemy, his protector, the most complicated person he'd ever known, was about to die, but more than that, Laurent represented everything that Heinrich had been fighting against. Laurent was the cold professional who saw soldiers as chess pieces, who would maximize casualties on both sides in pursuit of military objectives. If Laurent replaced Heinrich, the delicate balance that had kept so many people alive would be destroyed. Reinhold made his choice. He emerged from the shadows behind Laurent, his rifle raised and ready. "Step away from him." Laurent spun around, his own weapon coming up with practiced speed. For a moment, all three men stood frozen in a triangle of potential death, each with the power to kill the others, each trying to calculate the odds of survival. "Reinhold, no," Heinrich said quietly, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is," Reinhold replied, never taking his eyes off Laurent. "You're my friend. That makes it my fight." Laurent laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your friend is a French spy, German. He's been feeding intelligence to your enemies for months. He's probably responsible for the deaths of dozens of German soldiers." "I know," Reinhold said simply. "I've known for weeks." The shock on Laurent's face was almost comical. His professional composure cracked for the first time since his arrival. "And you're helping him." "I'm helping him keep people alive. Including me." What followed was perhaps the most surreal negotiation in military history. 3 men in a muddy trench, all pointing guns at each other, all trying to find a solution that wouldn't end in death for at least one of them. Laurent was a professional, but he was also practical. He could kill Heinrich, but then he'd have to kill Reinhold to keep his secret safe. And if he killed both of them, he'd lose all the intelligence networks Heinrich had established, all the carefully cultivated relationships that made effective espionage possible. Heinrich offered an alternative. He would continue as a French agent, but with Reinhold as his official contact within German ranks. Instead of one compromised spy, French intelligence would have a willing collaborator providing genuine information from within German military structures. Reinhold, for his part, agreed to provide selected German intelligence to the French in exchange for Heinrich's life and continued warnings about French operations that threatened their unit and other German soldiers. It was treason for both of them, but it was also survival. More than survival, it was a way of continuing their work to minimize casualties on both sides while satisfying the intelligence requirements of both military commands. Laurent considered the proposal with the cold calculation of a professional evaluator. "You're asking me to believe that a German soldier is willing to commit treason to save the life of a French spy." "I'm asking you to believe that a German soldier is willing to commit treason to save the life of his friend," Reinhold corrected. "And to continue a partnership that has kept more soldiers alive than any traditional intelligence operation could." "And you," Laurent turned to Heinrich, "you're willing to continue living this double life indefinitely." Heinrich was quiet for a moment. "I'm willing to continue living," he said simply. "And I'm willing to continue trying to keep other people alive. If that requires maintaining multiple loyalties, then that's what I'll do." Laurent accepted the arrangement, but with conditions that reflected his professional paranoia. Both Heinrich and Reinhold would be under constant surveillance by French intelligence assets. Any sign that they were playing double games with French command, any evidence that their information was deliberately misleading, and both would be eliminated without warning. Furthermore, they would be required to provide genuine intelligence that led to successful French operations. Their value to French command would be measured not just in the information they provided, but in the concrete military results that information achieved. For Heinrich, this meant accepting responsibility for German casualties that would result from his intelligence reports. For Reinhold, it meant becoming an active participant in espionage against his own country, risking not just his life but his honor and his soul. But it also meant they could continue their work to protect the soldiers in their immediate unit, continue the delicate balancing act that had kept so many people alive during the worst months of the war. For the remaining months of the war, Heinrich and Reinhold continued their impossible friendship under even more impossible circumstances. They saved each other's lives dozens of times, saved their unit from destruction repeatedly, and somehow managed to keep their secret from everyone else in the trench while also satisfying the intelligence requirements of French command. But the psychological toll was enormous. Both men were living lies within lies within lies. They were German and French, enemies and friends, traitors and patriots, protectors and betrayers, All at the same time, Heinrich continued his morning ritual of humming, Die Wacht am Rhein, but now both he and Reinhold understood the song as a kind of prayer for all the soldiers watching all the rivers and all the trenches, regardless of nationality or loyalty. It became their private anthem for the complex form of love they'd discovered, a love that transcended national boundaries and survived even the deepest betrayals. The other soldiers in their unit never discovered the truth, but they continued to benefit from the inexplicable good fortune that seemed to follow Heinrich and Reinhold. They avoided gas attacks through timely evacuations, survived artillery bombardments through mysteriously accurate predictions of safe positions, and received supplies and reinforcements at exactly the moments when they were most needed. But survival came at a cost that both men would carry for the rest of their lives. They were directly responsible for casualties on both sides: German soldiers who died because of intelligence Heinrich provided to French command, French soldiers who died because of warnings Heinrich provided to German command. They tried to minimize these casualties through careful selection of information, providing intelligence that would lead to military actions with strategic value but limited human cost. But they couldn't eliminate the moral weight of their choices, couldn't escape the fact that their survival required other people's deaths. In his diary, Reinhold wrote, "We have become gods of a sort, choosing who lives and who dies through the information we provide and withhold. But gods should be